Albert Einstein once famously said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Well, Cyberpunk 2077 could just be the very definition of that in video game form. We've been here before, we've done this before, but now patch 1.20 lands, and are we out of beta? So the first things up, we get a patch for 1.20 across every format. Let's start with the big boys in the PS5 and the Series X, the only consoles that support a 60 FPS mode, and it's probably the one you should all choose if you haven't already because it's the best of the bunch. But that doesn't mean we get a locked 60 FPS. As you can see, as before, they have made some changes to this title. They've certainly made changes to memory allocation and memory management because objects now appear and disappear and pop in a little sooner than they did before, and they can fade into view quite close, including when you lift the gun up on some of the older versions. But generally, performance is still not great. The Series X and the PlayStation 5 are the best of the bunch, with the PS5 being better overall. It still dynamically scales like all versions. I'm not going to touch on resolution here. It's pretty much the same as it was before. It's all about performance. And overall image quality looks very similar to the one I covered, patch 1.10. And obviously Destin's covered this title as well. But generally performance on the PlayStation 5 in heavy areas in terms of character models, dense areas of geometry, characters, AI, pathfinding, all of that can cause some dips into the mid 50s, low 50s. But if it's dipping, the Series X is dipping more. Now, again, as before, they still seem to have more character models, more pedestrians in the Series X version than they do on the PlayStation 5. But they do look to have cooled some of the geometry drawing on the Series X now to the PlayStation 5's performance mode. So you no longer seem to get that higher density that you still get on some of the older versions in that 30 FPS mode. So this is kind of a byproduct of the quality performance mode that effectively only the Series X has. So they've made sacrifices to that. But you can still get dips into the 40s, you can still get stutters, long pauses at certain points when it's loading and streaming assets, and like I say, they have made changes to the memory structure, but overall it doesn't make a huge difference on these two consoles, and with like-for-like comparisons to my previous one, I'm not seeing a massive delta between them. Now this is not to say that they haven't improved it, because that would be wrong of me to say that. They clearly have, and they've made massive strides in a lot of areas and fixing bugs, but performance is kind of a byproduct of what they've done on these updates, and really you're not seeing a huge shift on the PlayStation 5. And again, this is a similar story when we move over to the PlayStation Pro and the Xbox One X. So the premium consoles from last generation, and generally again they look pretty good, but they don't have all of the areas fixed that we discussed in the previous video. So again, you're seeing heavy dips, stutters into the 20s, the low 20s. It can still have hangs upwards of 100 milliseconds at points. There's long stutters and pauses. And sometimes, like I say, the memory allocation changes they've now made to the game can cause things like objects to pop in a little nearer, textures to be a little bit blurrier. And on these older consoles, it can also exacerbate some of these long stutters, as it's constantly trying to reduce the memory allocation, and therefore it streams in data, and you get some worse lurches that you didn't get on the PS4 Pro before, or at least not as often. So they've generally targeted reducing the memory footprint allocation they're using, because that's clearly a big issue, and obviously it can cause some of the issues you've seen before. As I mentioned in my previous video with the sound and the memory stomping and the stutters and judders when sound gets stopped. So they really have worked hard to improve the quality here, but there's still a long way to go. Generally, again, the PlayStation Pro is probably slightly better than the Xbox One X, but the Xbox One X has the best image quality of the two. It's got a higher resolution on average in this mode and the 30 FPS mode that they both run at, but there really isn't a great deal in that, and still overall the Pro just manages to perform that little bit better. On top of that, obviously the Xbox One X version and this Xbox One S both tear as well. They adaptively V-Sync tear at the top, whereas the PlayStation doesn't tear at all. You don't get this on the Series X and the PS5 at the 60 FPS mode. But overall, it's a close tie between the two. It's ever so slightly better, but again, it's the best of the last generation versions if you have to play it. It's still not anywhere close to a locked 30, and it can still feel inconsistent. And as bad as these are, obviously it gets far worse for the base consoles. Nothing has improved here. In fact, they are horrendous still, and I generally think they're worse. As I've already mentioned, when you start reducing the memory allocation, you'll then put more effort on streaming data in, more CPU allocations, instantiating stuff into RAM. So all of that is just going to put more pressure on these lower base consoles, and in actual fact I actually think that these versions are going backwards. So what we've got now is we've got a version across the PS4 and the Xbox One S. Well, the Xbox One S is never 30 in these tested sections. It doesn't hit 30 FPS. It's constantly below it. The PlayStation 4 is not far behind. If they're not juddering then stuttering, they're hanging. And overall, it just feels inconsistent to play. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. These versions needed more optimization and sacrifices made. They can run this game, but they need to cut it back. I mean, one of the issues is the fact that still the Xbox One S version seems to be running the same geometry setup as the quality mode on the Xbox One X and the Series X, and that's just silly. They should cut it back so it's at least at the performance level of the Series X, or maybe lower, and just reduce some of those areas of footprints to alleviate the strain on the GPU. It's heavily GPU bound at most times, and on top of that it's CPU bound, memory bound, so there's a lot of issues collectively here. Not to mention general codebase issues in terms of cache coherency and switching. All of that is standard. You can see it here over and over again. I'm not undermining the effort here, it's just the quality, but I'm repeating what I said last time. There's a lot of areas they could improve, and they need to refine and make this the game that they promised, certainly on these base consoles, and get it to that level, aside all the other issues. Sadly, 1.20 does improve a lot of things in terms of bugs and issues and all that, but to me, it's still a game that's in development and still in that beta state triage process. Anyway, if you like these deep dives into performance analysis on all consoles and PC, then please keep it IGN Games and check back soon for much more.